Welcome, everyone. Today, we're exploring the World Atlas Pyramid Reconstruction Study Guide. On this first slide, we're introducing Chapter 1, Political Geography, which focuses on the World Political Information Table. I'll briefly walk you through what this chapter covers. First, we have an intro summary, which I call the foundation layer. It explains that political geography shows us who controls what, including the world's states and territories, their governments, capitals, languages, and memberships in organizations. By reading these tables, we can decode concepts like sovereignty, dependency, and alliances, all from an early 2000 snapshot. Next, we move to the core content, which I call the exam-ready bricks. I'll show you how to read the table from left to right, starting with the region or country, which includes sovereign states plus dependencies and territories. Then, the area, measured in square miles, giving us the physical size, followed by the estimated population as of January 1st, 2004, that's the head count at that reference date. We also look at population density, which is simply population divided by area, so people per square mile. Then, the form of government and ruling power, indicating the constitution and the system of government, whether executive or legislative. We also check the capital, which is the seat of government, noting that some countries have multiple capitals or differences between de facto and de jure capitals. Next, we examine the predominant languages, distinguishing between official, working, and commonly spoken languages. And finally, we look at the international organizations to see membership abbreviations. As a quick note, I'll also touch on political status codes, which help us understand the nature of each country's sovereignty or dependency. Since this is our first slide, the cover slide, I want to welcome you all warmly and introduce the topic with enthusiasm. Today, we'll be learning how to decode political geography using this table, which is essential for understanding global relationships. I'll keep it short and engaging, so let's get started. Let's start by understanding the basic concept of sovereignty. When we say A, we mean a sovereign independent state, which has full control over its territory and affairs. Moving along the spectrum from A, the B, D labels show degrees of dependency or association, such as territories, protectorates, or areas with free association. Think of these as points on a scale from full independence to various forms of dependency. Now, when it comes to government types, there are some key distinctions to remember. A republic, for example, is a state where the head of state is not a monarch but an elected or appointed figure. Within republics, we have different systems. Presidential systems, where the executive is independent of the legislature and has fixed terms, and parliamentary systems, where the executive emerges from the legislature and can be dissolved, leading to more flexibility. Next, we have constitutional monarchies, which combine a monarch with constitutional limits. These are usually parliamentary, meaning the monarch's powers are limited by law. On the other hand, absolute or theocratic monarchies concentrate power in a sovereign or religious law, with little to no legal limits. Moving to the structure of sovereignty, we distinguish between federal and unitary states. Federal systems share sovereignty with states or provinces, giving them a degree of autonomy. Unitary states centralize authority in a single national government. There are also special governance forms like military, provisional, or transitional governments, which are often temporary and relate to specific timelines or situations. And within some states, there are autonomous regions or special administrative regions, which have distinct powers separate from the central government but are still part of the country. Now let's talk about capitals. Sometimes, the de jure capital, meaning the legal or official capital, differs from the de facto capital, which is where the government actually operates day to day. Some countries have split capitals, like judicial and legislative seats in different cities, while others plan to relocate their capital for strategic or developmental reasons. Language policy is another crucial aspect. States may designate an official language by law or recognize a national language symbolically. Some use working languages in government, while others recognize the most spoken language as the predominant one. In multilingual states, constitutions may be bilingual or multilingual, and lingua franca usage helps facilitate communication across diverse populations. Finally, regarding international organizations around 2004, many countries participate in various global or regional bodies. These memberships influence diplomatic relations, economic cooperation, and security arrangements, which all tie back to a country's sovereignty and international standing. Throughout this slide, the key takeaway is understanding the diversity of state structures, governance, and policies, and how they fit into the broader theme of state sovereignty and international relations. Let's take a look at some of the major international organizations involved in global and regional governance. We have the UN, or United Nations, which is the most comprehensive global organization, covering almost every aspect of international cooperation. Then there's the African Union, or AU, focusing on Africa's political and economic integration. The European Union, or EU, is a unique political and economic union of European countries. ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, promotes regional stability and economic growth in Southeast Asia. The OAS, or Organization of American States, covers the Americas and promotes peace and development. Moving to security and trade alliances, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is primarily a military alliance. CARICOM, the Caribbean Community, fosters economic integration and cooperation among Caribbean nations. ECO, the Economic Cooperation Organization, connects countries in Central and South Asia and the Middle East. The GCC, or Gulf Cooperation Council, unites Gulf countries around economic and security issues. MERCOSUR is a South American trade bloc, while SADC, the Southern African Development Community, works on regional integration in Southern Africa. Then there's NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was the main trade pact between the US, Canada, and Mexico before its replacement by USMCA. Remember, these organizations often overlap. Some countries belong to multiple groups, especially when it comes to security, trade, and regional cooperation. Understanding this network helps us see how countries coordinate and sometimes face conflicts between different memberships. This interconnected web shapes policies and influences stability across regions. All right, let's test our understanding by doing a little practice. We'll pick 3 countries from our table and calculate their densities, showing all the work along the way. Make sure to label each country as either unitary or federal and as presidential or parliamentary, based on the government notes. Next, choose a territory that isn't classified as a status. Find out which state is responsible for its defense and foreign affairs. Then, from the legend, pick out 3 organizational abbreviations. Briefly explain each one's purpose in just a line. Finally, look at the languages and think about the policy challenges each country might face, maybe issues around schooling, courts, or ballots. This exercise helps reinforce how these elements connect in real-world governance. Now, moving on to our capstone concept, let's flip the classroom. Imagine borders as power lines. The government type determines how power moves across these lines. Languages act as the interface, shaping communication and identity. And organizations, they're like power networks that connect different states. Here's a question to ponder. If a country exits a major trade bloc but remains in security alliances, which sectors do you think will feel that change first, and why? Think about how economic versus security interests might be affected differently. This ties back to the overall theme, understanding how power, borders, and organizations shape global politics. Let's dive into Chapter 2, focusing on demographic geography through the World Demographic Table. First, I'll give you a quick summary. Demography helps us understand how populations are built and how they change over time. This includes factors like growth, fertility, mortality, age structure, and urbanization. These elements are crucial because they shape future pressures on budgets, labor markets, housing, and security. Now, moving on to the core content, these are your exam-ready bricks. First, the population figure for 2004 is simply the total headcount at that time, giving us a baseline. The population per square mile in 2004 tells us about density, how crowded or sparse a population is, And you can compare this with the political table to see how territory and population relate. Next is the percent of the population that is urban, which indicates what share lives in cities or towns. This is a quick proxy for infrastructure demand. More urbanization usually means greater needs for roads, schools, and services. Then we have the crude birth rate, or CBR, measured per 1,000 people, usually from 2001 or 2003 data. It shows us how many babies are born per 1,000 population. Similarly, the crude death rate, or CDR, is deaths per 1,000 population. From these, we derive the natural increase percentage, which is roughly calculated as CBR minus CDR divided by 10. This figure excludes migration and gives us a sense of population growth or decline. Fertility rate is a bit different. It's the average number of children a woman has during her reproductive years. In developed countries, a replacement level is about 2.1 children per woman, which keeps the population stable over time. Infant mortality rate, measured per 1,000 live births, is a sensitive indicator of health system quality. Lower rates typically signal better healthcare and living conditions. Median age tells us the age at which half the population is older and half is younger. It's a quick snapshot of the age structure. And finally, life expectancy at birth, which differs for males and females, gives an average number of years a newborn can expect to live. A significant gap between genders can point to gender-specific health or social issues. Let's also briefly touch on some formulas. The natural increase percentage, or RNI, is approximately CBR minus CDR divided by 10. And doubling time, which tells us how long it takes for a population to double, is roughly 70 divided by the growth rate percentage. Understanding these key concepts allows us to interpret demographic data critically, giving insights into population dynamics and future trends, which are essential for planning and policy making. Let's take a closer look at some key dependency clues that help us understand demographic trends. When a country has a very low median age, say under 20, this indicates a youth bulge, which typically means there's a high demand for education and jobs as this young population enters the workforce. On the other hand, if the median age is very high, over 40, it suggests an aging population, which can lead to increased pressure on pensions and healthcare systems. Now, understanding these patterns also involves the demographic transition model, or DTM. Think of it in 4 stages. First, in the pre-industrial era, both birth and death rates are high, keeping population growth steady. Then, in the second stage, death rates fall rapidly while birth rates stay high, leading to a population boom. In the stabilizing stage, birth rates start to decline, matching low death rates, so growth slows down. The fourth stage sees both birth and death rates low, resulting in an aging population. And in some cases, birth rates can drop so low that the population could naturally decline over time. Migration also plays a significant role, especially when we see low or negative rate of natural increase, or RNI, but still observe urban areas expanding. This suggests that migration, either internal or external, is fueling city growth despite low natural population increase. Looking at regional patterns from the early 2000s, Europe generally shows low fertility rates, high life expectancy, and an older median age. Sub-Saharan Africa, on the other hand, has high fertility, high infant mortality, and very rapid population growth. East Asia is somewhat mixed. Some countries are aging quickly with low fertility rates. Latin America tends to be highly urbanized, with fertility rates falling from earlier higher levels. Finally, it's important to clarify what demography really is. It's not about wealth or GDP, nor about borders or ecosystems. Demography is all about the size, structure, and changes in populations, how they grow, shrink, and age over time. Let's talk about the age pyramid and how it shapes a country's budget. Think of it like a demographic blueprint. It's telling us where to allocate resources. When there's a youth bulge, meaning a lot of young people, the demand for schools and jobs skyrockets. Conversely, if there's an aging population, we see increased needs for clinics, healthcare, and pensions. Now, here's a key question. Which lever is faster for stabilizing a shrinking workforce? Immigration, pronatal policies, or automation? Immigration can bring in new workers quickly, so it's often the fastest way to boost the workforce. Pronatal policies, like incentives for having more children, take years to see results because it takes time for those children to enter the labor market. Automation, on the other hand, can be implemented relatively fast in certain sectors, but it requires investment and infrastructure. Overall, if we need rapid stabilization, immigration tends to be the quickest method, but each approach has its own implications and long-term effects. This is why understanding the shape of the age pyramid helps us make informed policy decisions that match our demographic realities. All right, let's dive into Chapter 3, Environmental Geography, specifically focusing on the World Environment Table. This slide gives us an overview of how well countries are protecting their ecosystems. We look at two main things: the share of protected areas and the counts of threatened species across different groups like mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, fish, and invertebrates. Think of it as a quick biodiversity and protection scorecard for each country. Now, on the core content side, we explore some key columns and what they mean. First, we have the total area in square miles, which is straightforward. Then, protected area from 2002, also in square miles and percentage, shows us how much land and water are legally reserved, like national parks and reserves. These protected areas are crucial, but their effectiveness varies. Next, species counts across different groups give us an idea of biodiversity richness. And then, the number of endangered species from 2003 highlights how many species are threatened within those groups. It's important to understand some key definitions here. A protected area, according to IUCN categories I through VI, can range from strict nature reserves to areas used sustainably. Biodiversity hotspots are regions with high levels of endemism that are also under significant threat. And remember, a paper park might look good on paper but could be poorly enforced in practice. From these data, we can compute some quick ratios. For example, protection intensity, which is the percentage of protected area. Higher is generally better, but the context matters. Threat intensity is the total number of endangered species divided by the total species count. This shows how threatened the biodiversity is. Lastly, species density looks at the number of species per area, giving us a sense of biodiversity richness relative to size, but we have to be cautious about different biomes. Overall, this slide helps us understand not just how much land is protected, but also the biodiversity health and threats facing various countries. It's a snapshot that highlights areas where conservation efforts are working or need improvement. Let's take a closer look at the patterns we saw in the 2000s. Starting with the tropics, these areas tend to have high species richness, meaning a lot of different species live there, but they also face significant threats like deforestation and fragmentation of their habitats. This combination makes conservation particularly urgent in these regions. Moving on to small island states, these places are home to many unique endemics, species found nowhere else in the world. But because of their limited size and resources, they are especially vulnerable to invasive species, which can quickly upset their fragile ecosystems. When we consider high-income states, we often see a higher percentage of protected areas on paper. However, the actual effectiveness of marine protection can vary quite a bit from one country to another, depending on enforcement and management. Large pastoral and agricultural exporters tend to have lower percentages of protected land inland, with conservation efforts often concentrated in specific biomes. This means that while some areas might be well protected, others remain vulnerable to land use pressures. Now, these patterns are not isolated. They're connected to broader policy levers we discussed in other chapters. For example, high agricultural expansion, as we saw in Chapter 4, leads to habitat loss and contributes to increasing numbers of endangered species. Similarly, high population density and rapid urban growth, covered in Chapter 2, cause habitat fragmentation, breaking up ecosystems into smaller, less viable patches. Governance capacity, which we explored in Chapter 1, plays a crucial role here too. The ability to enforce conservation laws and manage protected areas effectively can make a big difference in outcomes. When talking about defining conservation by exclusion, it's important to clarify that we're not just looking at crop yields or demographic data. Instead, we focus on the actual status of ecosystems and whether they are legally protected. To help understand this, I like to teach it this way. Think of a country as a computer. Protected areas are like firewalls, species are like files stored inside. If a country faces high threats but has low protection, it's like having no backups and a weak firewall, vulnerable to crashes and data loss. Finally, let's consider the implications of increasing protected areas. If a country raises its protected land from 8% to 20%, what happens? Well, there are trade-offs. Perhaps more land is taken out of production, which could impact agriculture, mining, or infrastructure development. Also, sometimes, we see an immediate rise in endangered species counts after new protections are established. This might seem counterintuitive, but it's often because these species are now better documented or previously overlooked, highlighting the importance of ongoing monitoring and management. Now, for this step, we'll be testing our approach by calculating the protection intensity for 3 different countries and then ranking them accordingly. This helps us identify which countries might need more focused conservation efforts. Next, from our data table, I want you to pick out one hotspot candidate. Remember, these are areas with many species and many threatened ones. Choosing a hotspot allows us to prioritize where conservation action could have the most significant impact. Finally, based on this hotspot, I want you to think about a corridor strategy. The goal here is to reduce fragmentation between 2 protected areas, creating a continuous habitat that better supports species movement and genetic exchange. Moving on, in our Flip the Classroom mini-lecture, I want to emphasize an important concept. Conservation is essentially risk management. It's about safeguarding our essential resources, food, water, and climate stability. And here's a thought-provoking question for you. If you had the budget to protect either one massive park or 5 smaller corridors that link fragments, which do you think would prevent extinctions more effectively in your country? And why? This question is designed to get you thinking about the most strategic ways to allocate limited resources for maximum conservation impact. Let's take a closer look at Chapter 4, focusing on the agricultural geography of the world, as shown in the World Agriculture Table. Here, we see how land is allocated for food production and which staples and livestock dominate different regions. This table helps us understand the links between climate, soils, inputs, and markets, all of which influence agricultural production. Now, moving to the core content, or what I like to call the exam-ready bricks. We have several columns that are key to interpreting this data, pages 252 to 253. First, there's the total area, which indicates the overall land available for agriculture. Then, the agricultural area from 2001 tells us how much land was actually used for farming. Think of it as the total footprint of agriculture at that time. Next, we see the cropland area, which includes arable land and permanent crops. This is the land specifically used to grow cereals, tubers, oilseeds, and fruits. Basically, the areas producing our food staples. Complementing that, there's the pasture area, which covers permanent meadows and pastures used for grazing animals like cattle, sheep, and pigs. Often, pastures are on marginal land that isn't suitable for crop farming. Another important aspect is the average production from 1999 to 2001, measured in 1,000 metric tons. This includes major crops like wheat, rice, and maize, as well as livestock like cattle, pigs, and sheep. Keep in mind, the exact commodities can vary depending on the specific row, so always check the column headers for clarity. Now, let's highlight some core distinctions. Cropland versus pasture. Cropland is primarily for cereals, tubers, oilseeds, and fruits, and typically requires higher labor and inputs. Pasture, on the other hand, is mainly for grazing animals and is often located on lands less suitable for crop production. Finally, we need to understand the difference between yield and output. High output can result from large areas of land, area-driven production, or from high yields, which come from intensive technology and irrigation. Both factors are crucial but serve different purposes. As for the staple geographies, rice is predominantly cultivated in monsoon Asia, especially in irrigated lowlands. Wheat, meanwhile, is more common in temperate belts and drylands, with different varieties suited for winter and spring planting. So, in summary, this table and these concepts help us see the big picture of global agriculture, how land use, climate, and technology shape what and how much we produce around the world. Maize, originally from the Americas, has become a truly global crop, now used worldwide for a variety of purposes, feeding people, providing food products, and even producing biofuels. As we look at the ratios we can compute, such as cropland share, which is the proportion of cropland in the total agricultural area, and pasture share, which represents the share of land used for grazing, we start to see patterns in land use. The cereal mix index helps us understand the relative importance of wheat, rice, and maize within total cereals, giving us insight into regional dietary staples and crop choices. Livestock pressure, calculated as the number of cattle or total livestock units divided by pasture area, serves as a proxy for stocking density, or how intensively land is used for grazing animals. Now, looking at the 2000 snapshot, we notice distinct regional patterns. High-income temperate areas tend to have high yields, are highly mechanized, and often focus on wheat and maize, with well-developed livestock value chains. In contrast, monsoon Asia is dominated by rice cultivation, mainly smallholder farms with increasing irrigation infrastructure. Semi-arid regions exporting large amounts of beef and sheep face climate variability risks, which can impact their land use strategies. Finally, tropical commodity belts, like those producing sugar, palm oil, coffee, and cocoa, show different land use dynamics that aren't always reflected in cereal data. It's also important to see how these land use patterns connect with broader themes. For example, protected area expansion can limit the expansion of cropland frontier, while population growth drives food demand and shifts crop mixes. Governance factors, such as land tenure, subsidies, and trade agreements, influence how land is used and managed. All these points highlight that land use and food output are interconnected, and understanding these patterns helps us grasp the bigger picture of global land use and food security. Let's talk about the idea that agriculture is like a national kitchen. Think of cropland as the stove where the cooking happens, and pasture as the pantry where meat and dairy ingredients are stored. The staples we rely on, like rice, wheat, and maize, are the base carbs that form the core of many diets. Now, countries differ based on their recipes, meaning the crop mix they grow, and the tools they use, such as inputs and irrigation methods. This analogy helps us see how different nations have unique food systems shaped by their resources and choices. Moving on to critical thinking, if you notice that a country has a small share of cropland but still produces a huge amount of maize, what do you think explains that? The answer is high yields, driven by advanced inputs, irrigation, and technology. It shows that productivity per hectare can be increased significantly with the right investments, making efficient use of limited land. Now, consider the trade-offs between export crops and food security crops. Export crops can boost a country's economy, but might compete with local food needs. Balancing these priorities involves complex policy decisions. Do you focus on maximizing exports or ensuring domestic food security? It's a classic trade-off. Let's move to an activity. Think about two different countries. First, calculate their cropland share and pasture share. Then, build a cereal mix pie chart for one of them, showing the percentages of wheat, rice, and maize. This will give us insights into their cuisine preferences, water use, and market dependencies. Finally, pick a pastoral exporting country and estimate its livestock pressure as high, medium, or low, and consider how this relates to drought risk. High livestock pressure often means greater vulnerability during droughts. Finally, to flip the classroom, remember, food systems are energy networks. They convert sun, soil, and water into calories we consume. So here's a question. In your country, what's the safer resilience upgrade? investing in irrigation and drought-tolerant seeds or cold chains and trade corridors. Think about which option would better safeguard food security and why. This kind of analysis helps us understand how to build resilient food systems that can withstand climate and market shocks. Let's start with the main idea here. This chapter is essentially a codebook for understanding maps, especially when it comes to geographic language and tools. Think of it as a handy glossary that explains what landform words mean in different languages, how names are abbreviated on maps, and how to pronounce tricky place names. First, we have the intro summary. It clarifies that this is about decoding the language of maps, what various landform terms mean across different languages, how map labels are shortened, and how to get the pronunciation right for unfamiliar or complex names. Next, our core content, or what I like to call the exam-ready bricks, focuses on patterns you'll see repeatedly. For landforms, remember words like fjord, which is a glacial inlet, or mesa, which is like a tabletop upland. Other examples include butte, which is an isolated hill, and wadi, an ephemeral stream that flows only after rain. For water-related terms, we have ria, a drowned river valley, estuary, sound, and lagoon. Relief words tend to repeat across languages. Think of mont, monte, or monte for mountain, rio, riu, riviere for river, lac, lago, sea for lake, and the suffixes and prefixes like fjord, ness, or vic/vic for bay. Recognizing these helps you pick up on place features no matter which language the map uses. Now, a quick tip on toponymy, place names. You'll often find an exonym, which is a foreign name for a place, versus the endonym, the local name. Knowing the difference is key for proper identification. Also, be aware of romanization systems, like pinyin versus older systems. Diacritics in these systems can change pronunciation and meaning, so they matter. Moving on to abbreviations, these are your map's survival kit. You'll see country and regional abbreviations, which are listed in your table. Organizational abbreviations are also common, from the legend in Chapter 1, and shorthand for map features like elevations, directions, and water features. Finally, the pronunciation guide is essential. It includes symbols for vowels and consonants, stress marks, and signs for indeterminate vowels. Mastering these helps you pronounce unfamiliar names correctly and avoid confusion. Overall, this chapter equips you with the tools to read maps confidently, understand foreign geographic terms, and decode abbreviations and pronunciations. It's all about making sense of the map language so you can interpret landforms, features, and place names accurately wherever you go. When decoding place names, it's important to expect exceptions, especially when dealing with local dialects or colonial spellings that might not follow standard patterns. A practical decoding workflow involves several steps. First, look for suffixes or prefixes. These often hint at the landform, like fjord, ness, or pol. Recognizing these helps us understand what kind of feature we're looking at. Next, check if the name is an abbreviation. This could indicate whether it's a province, an island, or a river. This step helps clarify the feature's context within the map. Then, apply the pronunciation key to get as close as possible to the local pronunciation, which is crucial for clear communication, especially when discussing these features aloud or with others. It's also important to record both the endonym, the local name, and the exonym, which is the name used by outsiders. For example, Kyiv versus Kiev or Mumbai versus Bombay. These distinctions can carry significant cultural or political weight. Moving on, define by exclusion. Remember, we're not just dealing with statistics. We're working with vocabulary, symbols, and sound rules that make the entire atlas understandable. This is what allows users to read and interpret the map efficiently. Teaching the map language is like understanding game HUD icons. Once you know what a symbol like fjord or mesa represents, you can read the map faster and make fewer mistakes. Next, engage in critical thinking. Consider how choices like using Kiev versus Kyiv influence perceptions and political contexts. When should cartographers switch from one to the other? It's a nuanced decision that reflects respect and awareness of local sensitivities. Finally, test your understanding by defining terms like mesa, fjord, wadi, taiga, and ria. Also, expand 5 abbreviations from your page and think about where each one might appear on a map. This ensures you not only recognize the terms, but also understand their application in real-world geography. Let's look at an example of a debated city and consider its endonym and exonym. Take the city known as Mumbai in India, which was previously called Bombay. The endonym, Mumbai, is the name used locally by residents and reflects the city's Marathi heritage. The exonym, Bombay, was given during colonial times and is more widely recognized internationally. I prefer using the endonym, Mumbai, because it respects local culture and identity and helps foster better understanding and respect in communication. Now, connecting this to our broader theme, geographic language acts like an API for Earth. It's a shared protocol that allows scientists, pilots, soldiers, and everyone else to communicate about places accurately. But what's the cost if we don't use consistent names? During disasters or conflicts, inconsistent naming can lead to confusion, delays in response, or even misidentification of locations. That's why standardizing geographic names is so crucial. It can literally save lives and improve coordination.